When we think about the story of constitutional government, our minds usually jump to a few specific places, right? But what if that whole story is missing its first and maybe its most important chapter? Today, we're going to dig way deeper into the real roots of the Republic.
So let's just kick things off with a huge question. Where did the idea of a government that's actually limited by law, where did that begin? It's a question that really gets to the very heart of what liberty is all about.
Yeah, the usual answer always points to the marble halls of Athens, the forums of Rome, or maybe the assembly rooms in Philadelphia. But what if the true blueprint, the actual architecture for government of the people under law, wasn't first drawn up in a city at all, but out in a desert?
Okay, so here's how we're going to break this down. We're going to trace this ancient idea through 5 key principles. First, we'll look at what might be the very first constitution. Then, this radical concept of a law that stands above any king. We'll also explore an ancient form of federalism, a powerful idea of equality, and finally, how all of this came together to build the architecture of liberty.
So, our first stop is a concept that you might think of as purely religious, but honestly, it's one of the most powerful political ideas in all of history, and that is the covenant.
Think about the Sinai covenant, where the people all agree, together, all the words that the Lord has spoken we will do. Now, this is so much more than just a spiritual moment. It's a foundational political act. This is one of the first times in recorded history we see a community forming a nation through a formal agreement, through mutual consent. It totally reframes the entire basis of authority.
And you can really see the difference here. On one side, you've got the ancient empires, Egypt, Babylon, where power was just based on force and coercion. But the Hebraic covenant, it was reciprocal. It wasn't about a conqueror just imposing his will. It was about creating what one scholar calls a community and responsibility, where your legitimacy comes from a shared moral obligation, not just from brute force.
And that idea leads us right to our second pillar, which was an absolutely revolutionary concept for its time, the idea that the law is superior to any human ruler. This is the principle of transcendent legal supremacy. In the great empires of Mesopotamia and Egypt, the king was often seen as a god. He was the source of all law. He was the law. The Hebraic model, it just completely flipped that on its head. In ancient Israel, the law was seen as transcendent, as coming from a higher source. It came before the king, it judged the king, and it bound the king. In this system, the law is the king. And the crucial evidence for this is laid out right here in the book of Deuteronomy. The king is not above the law, he's its number one subject. He has to write his own copy and read it every single day, not as a suggestion, but as a constitutional requirement. And why? To make sure his heart is not lifted above his brothers. This establishes that political legitimacy comes from obeying the law, not from your power or who your parents were. So, if the law is supreme, how do you actually structure a government to make that a reality? Well, that brings us to our third pillar. The common picture of ancient Israel is this simple monarchy, but the truth was way more complex. It was actually an early federal system, a whole network of distributed authority. So instead of a simple pyramid with a king at the very top, power was shared among all these different groups, each with its own job. You had elders handling local stuff, independent judges, priests guarding the sacred law, and a king with very limited executive power. And, maybe most importantly, you had prophets. They acted like constitutional watchdogs, holding even the most powerful kings accountable to that original covenant. What this system of ordered associations created was this incredible web of checks and balances. No single person or office could become all-powerful. Power was deliberately spread out and mutually restrained. And the goal was crystal clear, to prevent the concentration of power that almost always leads to tyranny. All right, pillar number 4. This one is huge because it's really the philosophical and theological bedrock for everything else we've talked about. It's the anthropology of liberty, the very idea of what it means to be human. So the book of Genesis declares that all human beings are made in the imago Dei, the image of God. Now, this was not just some poetic phrase, it had massive political consequences. Because if every single person reflects the divine, then no one, not a king, not a priest, not a commoner, has greater intrinsic worth than anybody else. This establishes a transcendent basis for moral equality. And here's where that profound idea gets translated into actual concrete law. You shall have one law for the native and for the stranger.
This right here is the root of political equality. What it means is that human dignity is not a gift from the government, it's an endowment from the Creator. The law's job is simply to recognize and protect that equal standing.
So let's pull all these threads together. How do these ancient ideas form a real structure, and how in the world did that structure travel through history to influence the modern world?
So, just to recap, we've seen these 5 interlocking pillars: a political order built on covenantal consent, a transcendent law that is above all rulers, a federal system of distributed power, the moral equality of every person, and institutions actually designed for accountability. When you put them all together, they form a complete constitutional vision. And this vision didn't just disappear, it was rediscovered and re-energized during the Reformation, with its focus on conscience and resisting tyranny. Then it was actually put into practice in early America, with documents like the Mayflower Compact. And finally, this long intellectual lineage provided the very architectural form for the U.S. Constitution.
So the bottom line is this. The Hebraic Republic gave us the essential architecture for Western liberty. It provided the blueprint for a society where authority is limited, where power is distributed, and where the dignity of every single person is protected by a higher law that no government can ever erase.
And that leaves us with one last thing to think about. As we look at the world today, which of these ancient principles, covenant, higher law, distributed power, or moral equality, do you think are most essential and maybe most at risk for preserving liberty in our own time?